The sun had barely pushed through the grey London sky when the black convoy of government cars rolled up to the gates of Buckingham Palace. The sound of engines mixed with the steady rhythm of boots on the gravel path as guards stood in perfect stillness, their red coats bright against the dull morning light. Among the American officials stepping out of the cars was Senator J.D. Vance, dressed sharply in a dark suit and carrying the same self-assured air he always wore back home. It was his first official visit to the United Kingdom, and he had been told this meeting was about strengthening diplomatic ties. But for him, it was also a chance to make an impression, not just on British leaders but on the cameras that followed him wherever he went. Vance had built a reputation for being outspoken, and he liked to show confidence, especially when the world was watching. As he stepped out, he looked around at the palace courtyard. Everything felt different from what he was used to. The precision, the silence, the sense of deep respect. He watched the royal guard standing like statues, eyes forward, rifles at their sides. Their discipline fascinated him. They didn't flinch. They didn't blink. They didn't even acknowledge the noise of tourists taking photos a few feet away. One of his aides whispered, "Sir, we should move inside. The ambassador is waiting," but Vance wasn't listening. His attention stayed on the guard nearest to him, a tall soldier with a firm jaw and expressionless face. He chuckled under his breath and said loud enough for others to hear, "Now that's dedication. Bet he hasn't smiled in years." A few people nearby laughed politely, though some kept their eyes down, unsure if he was serious. The guard, as expected, didn't react. That seemed to bother Vance a little. He took a few steps closer, studying the soldier. "You know," he said, half joking, half challenging, "in the U.S., soldiers would salute an elected official. It's called respect." The guard remained silent, motionless. Vance smirked. "Guess that doesn't apply here, huh?" Tourists standing nearby started to pay attention. Phones came up. Someone whispered, "He shouldn't do that." Another muttered, "That's a royal guard, mate. They don't mess around." But Vance wasn't trying to be rude, at least not in his own mind. He thought it was lighthearted. To him, it was just an American politician having a little fun. Yet the way he said things, the way he carried himself, came across differently. His words hung in the air, and the guard's silence made it worse. Every second that passed without a reaction made Vance look smaller in front of the crowd, and he didn't like that feeling. He waved his hand in front of the soldier's face, pretending to check if the man was even real. The tourists gasped. His aide tried to step in, whispering urgently, "Senator, please, we should go inside." But Vance brushed him off. "Relax. I just want to see if he's really trained not to move." The air around them felt heavier now. A couple of British security officers began to watch closely from a distance. The guard's eyes stayed fixed forward, but there was tension in his stance, a kind that came only when someone pushed a boundary they shouldn't. "Come on, soldier," Vance said, still smiling. "Just one salute. That's all I'm asking." There was no response, only the sound of boots shifting slightly somewhere down the line of guards. The tourists were whispering, recording, trying not to draw attention to themselves. A small group of children stared in confusion, asking their parents what was happening. Vance didn't seem to notice. He had convinced himself it was harmless fun, that no one would take it seriously. But in that courtyard, surrounded by centuries of tradition and protocol, every movement, every word mattered. The guard's eyes suddenly shifted. It was a tiny movement, but it was enough to make the air crackle with tension. Vance took a step back, not sure what would happen next. His smile faltered for just a second. A British officer in a dark coat approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. He spoke with calm authority. "Sir, I must ask you to step back." Vance blinked, confused. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I was just testing his discipline." "The Queen's Guard is not for testing," the officer said, his tone still respectful but firm. "They are serving soldiers. Please keep your distance." The tourists had stopped talking altogether now. All that could be heard was the distant sound of car engines and a few birds overhead. The guard hadn't moved, but the tension in the scene was impossible to ignore. Vance finally took a small step back, adjusting his suit jacket, pretending to play it off as a joke. All right, he said with a forced laugh. "Didn't mean any harm. Just a bit of fun." The officer gave a short nod but didn't smile. "Understood, sir. But please remember, you are at Buckingham Palace. The guards are under strict command." Vance nodded, though he looked slightly irritated. He turned toward his aide and muttered something under his breath about how uptight the British could be. Then he started walking toward the main entrance, trying to act as though nothing had happened. Behind him, the tourists slowly lowered their phones. Some exchanged looks that said everything, that quiet disbelief that someone so important could show such poor judgment in such a respected place. Inside the palace, the meeting went on as planned, but the mood around Vance had shifted. His aides were tense, aware that the little stunt outside might have been recorded. One of them whispered to another, "If that ends up online, we're going to have a problem." Hours later, when the visit wrapped up, Vance was still unaware that his interaction with the guard had already made its way to social media. Clips were spreading fast, headlines starting to form. People were already commenting, dissecting every word and gesture. Some called it arrogance. Others said it was cultural ignorance. Either way, it was out there. Back at his hotel that evening, Vance sat by the window, scrolling through his phone. He saw the video, him waving his hand in front of the guard, his joking tone, the awkward silence afterward. It looked worse than he remembered. Online, people were mocking the incident. There were memes, jokes, even political commentators weighing in. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "They're overreacting," he muttered to himself. But deep down, a small part of him knew he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. It wasn't just about him or the guard. It was about respect, something that didn't bend easily in places built on tradition. The next morning, the embassy called his office. The tone was careful but clear. The palace had not filed any complaint, but the incident had caused discomfort. The British officials described it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Vance agreed to issue a polite clarification later that week, though he still believed the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. As he packed for his flight home, he glanced one last time at a photo on his phone. The guard standing in perfect stillness, unbothered, professional, unwavering. There was something in that stillness that stayed with him, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was realization that sometimes strength isn't shown by speaking louder, but by standing still when someone tries to shake your ground. He didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter outside Buckingham Palace would follow him across oceans. The video would go viral. People would debate it, criticize it, analyze it. But for now, as his plane lifted off from Heathrow Airport, he sat quietly, staring out the window, thinking about that guard who never flinched, and how a moment of pride had turned into a silent lesson in humility. By the time Senator Vance returned to Washington, the clip had already made its way onto every major social media platform. At first, he thought it would fade away in a day or two like most internet stories. But this one didn't. It kept growing, spreading from political circles to entertainment news and even late-night talk shows. Headlines described it with words like disrespect, ego, and a lesson in humility. He watched the reactions with a stiff jaw, scrolling through endless comments that questioned his behavior. Some defended him, calling it harmless fun, while others said he embarrassed his country abroad. The mix of opinions only made things worse. Inside his office, the atmosphere was tense. His aides spoke quietly, trying to manage the fallout. They had drafted statements and possible responses, but nothing seemed right. Every word they wrote either sounded defensive or too forced. Vance sat by the window, pretending not to care, but the weight of it was obvious in his silence. "It's not that big a deal," he finally said, setting his phone down. "People are just overreacting. The internet loves drama." One of his senior aides hesitated before replying. "Sir, this isn't going away." The British media picked it up. BBC and The Guardian both ran stories about it this morning. Vance frowned. "They're making it sound like I attacked someone. I just talked to a soldier." "Yes, sir, but to them, that soldier represents something sacred," the aide said gently. "The Royal Guard isn't just for show. It's tied to history and national pride." Vance rubbed his temples. He wasn't used to being corrected by his own staff, but he also knew they were right. Still, pride made it hard for him to admit it. He had built his career on confidence, on never backing down, and apologizing now felt like weakness. A few hours later, his phone rang again, this time from the U.S. Embassy in London. The diplomat on the line was polite but clear. "Senator, the palace has not issued a formal statement, but the situation has caused discomfort. It would help ease tensions if you made a public clarification." Vance forced a laugh. Discomfort? I didn't insult anyone. Sir, perception matters, the voice said. Even if you didn't mean harm, how it looked to the public is another story. He hung up after promising to consider it, though he wasn't convinced. But the next morning, things took a new turn. A well-known British news channel aired a full segment replaying the video, slowed down with commentary. They analyzed every second, the way he waved his hand in the guard's face, the officer's approach, his final smirk before walking away. They compared it to previous incidents where tourists had been warned for the same behavior. The anchor ended the piece by saying, "Respect is not something one demands. It is something one earns." That line stayed with him longer than he expected. Later that day, he walked into a committee meeting, but it was clear his mind was elsewhere. Even his colleagues gave him strange looks, some amused, others uncomfortable. After the session ended, one senator joked lightly, "Heard you made quite an impression across the pond." Vance forced a smile. "Guess I'm international now." But the joke didn't land. People laughed politely, then quickly moved on to other topics. The attention that used to make him feel powerful now felt isolating. That evening, he sat in his office long after everyone else left. The city outside glowed with the orange lights of cars and street lamps. His phone buzzed again, a message from one of his assistants showing a new trending post. It was a clip of the guard standing firm, captioned, "Real strength doesn't need to move." It had millions of views. He watched it twice, then 3 times. The stillness of the guard, the quiet strength, the patience, it all looked different now. For the first time, he wondered how the soldier must have felt in that moment, standing there while someone of political power tried to provoke him. It wasn't funny anymore. The next morning, Vance met with his communications team. The room was quiet until he finally spoke. "All right, let's write something simple. No excuses, no jokes, just respect." The team looked surprised but relieved. One of them asked, "A full apology?" He paused, then said, "Let's call it an acknowledgement." They worked through drafts for hours. Every word was debated. It had to sound sincere without sounding rehearsed. Finally, they agreed on a short statement. It said he admired the discipline of the Royal Guard and regretted that his actions might have been seen as disrespectful. He added that he had learned something valuable about traditions and cultural respect. When it was released, reactions were mixed. Some appreciated the humility. Others said it was too little, too late. But slowly, the noise began to fade. New stories filled the headlines, and his incident drifted into the background. Yet something inside Vance had shifted. He didn't admit it publicly, but privately he kept thinking about that moment outside the palace. The unwavering guard, the silence, the calm authority. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about character. A week later, he received a letter from the British Embassy thanking him for his statement. It was brief but kind. At the bottom, there was a handwritten note from a British officer who had been there that day. It said, "Respect goes both ways, Senator. Thank you for understanding." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. For once, he didn't feel defensive or irritated. Instead, he felt something that had been missing for a long time: humility. In the days that followed, whenever he walked past a security officer or military personnel, he looked at them differently. There was a quiet respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Once, at a veterans event, he even mentioned the Royal Guard story himself. The crowd listened closely as he described what happened, not to make excuses but to share what he had learned. He said, "Sometimes we forget that discipline and dignity are their own forms of strength. I learned that the hard way, standing in front of a man who didn't need to speak a word to make his point." The audience clapped softly, not because he was powerful, but because, for a brief moment, he was honest. That night, as he sat alone in his home office, he opened his laptop and found the same video again. It had been reposted with a different caption this time: "How one man learned respect from silence." He watched it quietly, no longer cringing, no longer defensive, just reflective. The next morning, before heading to work, he looked at himself in the mirror. The same confident expression, the same posture, but now there was something calmer about it. The world hadn't changed, but he had. What had started as a simple moment of pride had turned into something else entirely. A reminder that real leadership wasn't about demanding respect. It was about earning it even when no one was watching. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson can come from someone who never says a single word. Several months had passed since the Buckingham Palace incident, but it still lingered in quiet corners of Senator Vance's mind. He had gone back to his usual work routine, attending meetings, speaking at events, and appearing on TV interviews. But now something about his tone had changed. He was more measured, less quick to react, and sometimes even paused before answering questions. Those who knew him well noticed the difference but didn't ask about it. They could tell something inside him had shifted. One afternoon, Vance was invited to speak at a conference for veterans and international officers. It wasn't a big event, but it drew a respectable audience of soldiers, diplomats, and public officials. He hadn't planned to mention the Royal Guard story again. He thought it was behind him, but as he looked around the room and saw men and women in uniform, he felt the need to share what he had learned. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and said, "You know, sometimes the biggest lessons don't come from victories or speeches. They come from mistakes. I learned mine standing in front of a guard in London who never said a word." The audience grew quiet. He went on, describing the moment in simple, honest terms. He didn't exaggerate or joke. He told them how he misunderstood the meaning of discipline and how silence had humbled him. When he finished, the room stayed silent for a few seconds, then slowly filled with applause. It wasn't loud, but it was warm and genuine. For the first time, Vance felt like people were clapping for his honesty, not his position. After the event, an older veteran approached him. He was walking with a cane and wore a faded service pin on his jacket. "You know," the man said softly, "standing still takes strength too. Sometimes it's harder than fighting back." Vance smiled and nodded. "I understand that now." That night, back at his hotel, he sat on the edge of the bed and thought about that line. Standing still takes strength. He realized that was exactly what he had missed all along. The Royal Guard hadn't ignored him out of arrogance. He had been doing his duty, showing restraint and discipline in the face of provocation. That kind of strength didn't need applause. The next morning, Vance received a message from a journalist who wanted to do a follow-up interview about his experience in London. Normally, he avoided rehashing old controversies, but this time he agreed. He wanted to set the record straight, not to defend himself, but to talk about what he had learned. When the interview aired a few days later, it surprised people. The same man who once looked proud and untouchable now spoke calmly, almost humbly. "It's easy to forget that respect is universal," he said during the interview. "It doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether it's a palace in London or a courthouse in Ohio. Respect looks the same everywhere. You just have to be willing to see it." The clip spread quickly online, but this time the reaction was different. People didn't mock him. They shared his words with captions like "growth matters" and "he actually learned from it." Even some British viewers who had criticized him before commented that they respected his change of heart. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal. But the lesson stayed with him in small ways. When he walked into meetings, he made a point to listen more than he spoke. When young staffers made mistakes, he corrected them calmly instead of snapping. And whenever he traveled abroad again, he took the time to learn about local customs before stepping off the plane. A few months later, he returned to London, not for politics but for a quiet visit. This time there were no cameras, no speeches, no entourage, just him, walking along the same cobblestone path outside Buckingham Palace. The air was crisp, the sky overcast as always, and the line of guards stood tall just as before. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets. The same silence surrounded them, the kind that carried weight. He didn't try to talk or get attention. He just stood there for a few moments, watching the guard's stillness. For the first time, he understood what that moment really meant. It wasn't about him. It never was. A few tourists nearby recognized him and started whispering. One of them raised a phone to record, but he lifted a hand politely and shook his head. The person nodded and put the phone away. He didn't need another viral clip. He just wanted to stand there and pay quiet respect. As he turned to leave, one of the palace officers approached him with a friendly smile. "Good to see you again, Senator," the man said. "I take it this visit is a bit calmer." Vance smiled. "Much calmer. I think I understand things better now." The officer nodded knowingly. "Sometimes understanding takes a while. I'm glad you came back. They shook hands, and for a brief moment both men shared a sense of unspoken respect. Vance walked away slowly, feeling lighter than before. That night he sat in his hotel room again, looking out the window at the London skyline. He thought about how much had changed since his last visit. Back then he had seen the guard as someone refusing him respect. Now he saw him as someone showing him what respect really meant. It was strange how life had a way of turning embarrassing moments into lessons that stayed with you forever. When he returned to the States, his schedule filled up quickly again. There were hearings to attend, meetings to lead, and interviews to give. But no matter how busy things got, that moment in London remained with him. It became something he quietly carried, a reminder of how easily pride could blind a person to what truly mattered. One afternoon, a young intern in his office accidentally deleted an important document. She looked terrified when she came to tell him. In the past, he might have scolded her sharply, but instead he smiled gently and said, "We all make mistakes. Just don't let one moment define how you move forward." The intern nodded with visible relief, and after she left, Vance realized he had just spoken to her the same way that officer had spoken to him outside the palace. Firm, but kind. Later that evening, he received a handwritten letter from the same officer who had intervened that day months ago. The note was short and simple. True respect is shown not by words, but by actions. I'm glad you understood that. There was no official seal, no formal title, just a signature. Vance smiled as he folded the letter and placed it next to the first one in his drawer. Over time, the incident became something he rarely talked about, but he never forgot it. It shaped how he saw people, how he led, and how he carried himself. When reporters later asked about leadership, he often said, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about knowing when silence speaks louder than words." Years later, long after the viral moment had faded from memory, the story of the American senator and the royal guard still floated around on the internet. But now it was told differently. People shared it not as a tale of arrogance, but as one of growth. The comments had changed too. Instead of criticism, there were lines like, "He learned. That's what matters." And somewhere in London, under the same gray sky, the royal guard still stood at their posts, steady, silent, and unshaken. The senator's story had passed, but their lesson remained timeless. Respect, discipline, and humility were things that never went out of style. For Vance, that single encounter outside Buckingham Palace became more than just a story from his past. It became the quiet voice in the back of his mind whenever he spoke to a crowd, signed a document, or met someone new. It reminded him that real strength wasn't about demanding attention or proving power. It was about holding your ground with grace, even when the world was watching. And in that realization, he finally understood that the moment that once embarrassed him had, in truth, shaped the best part of who he had become. Months had passed since Senator Vance's second visit to London, yet the memory of the royal guard lingered in the corners of his mind. Even in the middle of his busiest days, when meetings piled up and deadlines pressed hard, he found himself thinking about that quiet moment in front of the palace. It was strange how something so brief could leave such a lasting impression. One afternoon, Vance received an unexpected invitation. A group of international leaders was scheduled to tour the palace, and he was asked to participate as part of a cultural exchange program. Initially, he hesitated. He knew that returning to the palace could dredge up memories that made him uncomfortable, but something inside nudged him to accept. Perhaps this time he would approach it differently. The day arrived, gray and cool as London mornings often were. As he walked up to Buckingham Palace, he noticed the same line of guards, their red coats bright against the stone walls. He felt a calm steadiness settle over him, quite unlike the nervous pride he had felt months ago. He had learned to respect their discipline and presence, and now he understood it wasn't a test to provoke him. It was a demonstration of centuries of duty and tradition. During the tour, he spoke with several British officials and military personnel. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing stories about the history of the palace, the royal guard, and the significance of their role. Vance realized that his previous encounter had been a moment of cultural ignorance, and he silently resolved to never take such things lightly again. The difference between his first visit and this one was clear. Humility now guided his steps. As the group moved through the courtyard, a few tourists noticed him and waved. He smiled politely and continued without seeking attention. This was different from before. There was no need to impress anyone. For the first time, he felt at ease in a place that had once seemed intimidating. The silence of the guards no longer threatened him. It inspired him. After the tour, a young officer approached him and said quietly, "Senator, it is good to see you back. Your respect for the traditions here has not gone unnoticed." Vance nodded, touched by the sincerity in the officer's voice. "I've learned a lot," he admitted. "More than I expected, actually," the officer smiled. "Sometimes the most important lessons are the quiet ones." Later that evening, Vance sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on the day. He remembered the way he had reacted during his first visit. The smirk, the insistence on being acknowledged, and the sense of superiority he had carried. The contrast with today was stark. Now he felt grateful, humbled by the professionalism and discipline he had once challenged. He pulled out his phone and watched clips of his first encounter again. This time he didn't flinch or cringe. He saw the moment for what it was. A lesson in patience, restraint, and dignity. He realized that the guard's stillness had forced him to look inward, to examine his behavior and to recognize his own flaws. It was uncomfortable then, but it had shaped him in ways he hadn't appreciated until now. The following days were quieter than usual. Vance spent time reviewing speeches, reading reports, and writing letters. But the lesson from the Royal Guard stayed with him. In meetings, he approached conversations differently, giving colleagues room to speak, listening to opposing opinions with patience, and resisting the urge to dominate every discussion. People began to notice. Staffers commented that he seemed calmer, more approachable and thoughtful. One morning, he received an email from a young congressional aide in the UK. She had seen the recent interview he gave about his experience with the Royal Guard and wrote to say that it had inspired her. "Thank you for sharing your story," she wrote. "It reminded me that humility is just as important as courage." Vance smiled, touched by her words. He replied briefly, encouraging her to continue learning and growing, and reminded himself that the lessons he had learned were worth sharing quietly when appropriate. Later that week, Vance was invited to a public event at a military academy. He was asked to give a speech about leadership and responsibility. As he stood at the podium, he remembered the guard's unwavering presence and the silence that had spoken volumes. He decided to share his experience not for entertainment, not for attention, but to teach. "I once thought leadership was about asserting authority," he said. "I thought that showing strength meant making others recognize my position. But I learned that true leadership is often quiet. It is patient. It is respectful. It listens and learns before it speaks. I learned that from a soldier who didn't move or speak but taught me more than I expected." The audience listened intently. There were nods, quiet murmurs, and a sense of connection. When he finished, the applause was sincere and long. He left the stage feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had faced the memory that once embarrassed him and turned it into something meaningful. That evening, alone in his room, he reflected on how far he had come. He realized that the Royal Guard had given him a gift, a perspective on respect, patience, and humility that he would carry for the rest of his life. The lesson wasn't just about him or about the moment of pride he had once felt. It was about understanding the power of discipline, the importance of listening, and the quiet strength that doesn't need acknowledgement. The following weeks brought new challenges and responsibilities. But Vance handled them with a steadiness he hadn't possessed before. Decisions were made more thoughtfully, conversations were approached with care, and interactions with colleagues and staff carried a deeper respect. The Guard's lesson was with him every step of the way. Even when he traveled to other countries for diplomatic work, he remembered the stillness of the Guard and the silence that spoke louder than words. He observed other cultures with curiosity and respect, asked questions, and approached traditions with humility. The world felt wider, richer, and more complex than it had before. And through it all, he carried a quiet confidence, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that earned it naturally. Years later, long after the viral clip of his first encounter had faded from public memory, the lesson remained vivid in his mind. He often shared it in interviews, speeches, and conversations, not to boast or recount an embarrassing story, but to remind others of the value of patience, respect, and humility. He told young staffers, fellow politicians, and students, sometimes the strongest lesson comes from someone who doesn't speak. from someone who simply stands their ground, and in every retelling, he remembered that first moment outside Buckingham Palace, the tension, the silence, the steady gaze of a guard who didn't flinch. It had shaped him, humbled him, and taught him that true strength often lies in stillness, in quiet confidence, and in the respect that is earned, not demanded. Time moved on, but the lesson Senator Vance had learned from the Royal Guard never left him. He continued his work in politics, traveled for diplomatic missions, and attended public events. Yet the memory of that silent soldier remained vivid in his mind. He often reflected on how a simple act of discipline had changed his perspective on leadership, respect, and humility. Months after his second visit to London, Vance was asked to speak at a global leadership summit. The audience included politicians, diplomats, and military leaders from around the world. He had prepared his speech with care, but he knew he wanted to include something personal. He decided to share the story that had shaped him more than any other experience. Standing at the podium, he began. Years ago, during an official visit to London, I encountered a royal guard. At the time, I thought I understood respect and authority. I believed that my position demanded recognition. But that day I learned that true strength is often quiet. The guard never spoke. He never moved. And in his silence, he taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. The audience listened intently. Some had seen the viral video, others had not. But everyone could feel the sincerity in his voice. He went on to explain how he had initially been frustrated, how his pride had made him impatient and inconsiderate. He described the embarrassment he had felt when he realized the guard was simply performing his duty, not defying him. And he shared how that moment had changed him, influencing the way he treated people and made decisions ever since. After the speech, several attendees approached him. One young diplomat said, "I've never thought about silence in that way. It's remarkable how much can be communicated without words." Another officer added, "Your story reminds us that leadership is not about asserting power, but about understanding responsibility." Vance nodded, quietly pleased that the lesson was reaching others. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the idea itself, about the values of patience, respect, and humility. Back at home, he continued to live with the memory of the guard. He noticed small changes in himself. When staffers made mistakes, he corrected them calmly. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke. And when conflicts arose, he sought understanding first instead of immediately asserting authority. The change was subtle, but those around him could see it. One evening, Vance sat in his office looking over reports and correspondence. He thought back to the first moment he had waved in front of the guard, expecting acknowledgement. He remembered the officer who had calmly intervened and the guard who had stood firm. He realized that embarrassment had been necessary for growth. If he had been praised or given immediate recognition, he might never have learned the value of patience and humility. He opened a drawer and pulled out the letters he had received from the embassy and the officer. Reading them again, he smiled at the quiet encouragement they contained. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Respect goes both ways, and true strength is shown in stillness. Those phrases had become a guide for him, reminders of the lessons he had learned. In the following months, Vance's colleagues noticed a change in his approach. In one meeting, a heated debate over policy arose. In the past, he might have raised his voice, pushed his opinion, and tried to dominate the conversation. Instead, he listened carefully, asked questions to understand the other perspectives, and offered his own insights only after considering all points. The room responded differently. There was collaboration instead of tension. He realized the guard's lesson had extended far beyond that palace courtyard. Later, during another trip to Europe, Vance visited a military academy in Germany. While walking through the courtyard, he observed the cadets standing in formation. He thought about the Royal Guard again, about how discipline and patience could teach lessons without a single word. He shared the story with the cadets, explaining how silence and stillness could communicate respect and authority in ways words could not. The cadets listened, inspired by the personal insight of someone who had learned through experience. Back home, the story of the Royal Guard occasionally resurfaced in the media. But now, it was often mentioned in the context of leadership and humility. Commentators referred to it as a moment of growth, and political analysts noted how it had shaped Vance's approach to leadership. It was no longer an embarrassing incident, but a story of personal development. Over time, Vance reflected on the deeper meaning of that experience. He realized that life often presents moments that challenge pride and ego, and that true strength is learning from those moments instead of reacting impulsively. The Royal Guard had been a teacher without intending to be, a reminder that authority and respect are earned through patience, discipline, and humility. Years later, when Vance met with young leaders and interns, he often shared the story. He spoke about standing quietly in the presence of discipline, about the power of restraint, and about the importance of understanding before acting. He emphasized that leadership was not about demanding attention, but about earning it through consistent actions and thoughtful behavior. One day, he received a letter from a young student who had seen one of his talks. The student wrote, "Your story about the Royal Guard helped me understand that listening and patience are just as important as speaking and acting. Thank you for sharing it." Vance kept the letter in his office, a tangible reminder that the lesson he had learned continued to inspire others. Even decades later, whenever he faced challenging situations, he recalled the quiet strength of the Guard. He thought about standing firm without aggression, about showing respect without words, and about letting discipline guide behavior. Those memories shaped his decisions, his relationships, and his understanding of leadership in ways he could never have anticipated. In the end, the moment outside Buckingham Palace had become more than a brief incident. It had become a lifelong guide. Vance often reflected on it in quiet moments, understanding that the greatest lessons sometimes come in the simplest forms. The Guard's stillness had spoken louder than any words could, teaching him patience, humility, and the importance of true respect. He never forgot that day, and in sharing it with others, he helped ensure that the lesson lived on. It was a story of growth, of understanding, and of learning to value the quiet strength of those who hold firm without needing recognition. And through it all, Vance had become a different leader, a better listener, and a person who understood that sometimes the most powerful moments in life are the ones that humble you, quietly, but forever.